Hi, everyone. This is Valerie Leonard. I want to say thank you so much for being patient. We had a little technical difficulty at 10 o'clock, and we are regrouping today at 10:30. And again, thank you for your patience. Can you please, if you're in the audience, type your name, let us know where you're from and what issues you might be having with compliance. We're going to be talking about Form 990 and how to use that as a marketing tool. And before we do that, as usual, I want to tell you a little bit about Nonprofit Utopia, a little bit about myself, and then we will get into today's discussion. Again, my name is Valerie Leonard. I am the founder of Nonprofit Utopia. We are the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders, and we have shared a very safe environment where our members can talk about issues of concern on a daily basis. We'd love to have you join us. If you're interested in joining, you can do so at nonprofitutopia.mn.co. And today we're going to be finishing up the December discussion, which is really focusing on year end activities. And year end activities typically include things like filing with the IRS, getting your Form 990 together. Now, your fiscal year end may not be in December, it may be in June, but even if it is at some other time other than December, this is a very important discussion for us to have. Typically when we talk about Form 990, we are looking at, filing our financials. We tend to do the Form 990 if we're a nonprofit organization, tend to do it when we are doing our financial audit and we have the auditor to do it. And just so you know, I'm not a nonprofit organization, I'm a for profit, but I tend to use the word we. So when nonprofits do the Form 90, they typically are focusing on the financial information, and there are a number of opportunities that you can use it for marketing as well. So we're going to go through the Form 990. We're going to how, share which sections that you can use to actually market your program, and then we're going to show you some real live examples. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show you the IRS Form 990. All right, so this is Form 990 as of 2020. And you should also be aware that these Form 990s change from time to time. And if you were with us last week when we talked to Ms. Coleman about Cabot House and how she used the Form 990 as well as the Guide Star to actually increase fundraising, you'll recall that she mentioned that we should not be using the short postcard. In spite of the fact that you might have small revenues, you still should use the full Form 990 so that you can get the maximum benefits. So if you bring in $2 or $1 million, you should be using Form 990 or Form 990 EZ. All right, so this is the top of the form, and you have very basic information, which is your name, address, and all that good stuff. And when we look at part one, this is the summary financial information here. So you want to talk about your organization's mission or your most significant activities. And you notice here that there's very little room. So you're going to finish this rather than attach a separate piece of paper. You're going to use their Schedule O, which is a catch all form where you can continue to answer any questions. And I'll share with you a copy of that. All right. So, in the event that your mission is longer than these 3 lines, or in the event that your activities take up more than these 3 lines, you want to use Schedule O and not just a regular piece of paper. All right. So again, this is basically a summary of all of your financial information, and there'll be another section where you can go into more detail. And then part two is the signature block. And make sure that when you get this signed, that not only your executive director signs it, but your board treasurer. You want to make sure that people are definitely kept in the loop. All right, so under part three, this is the area where we can really begin to use for marketing purposes. You notice here that they say check if Schedule O contains a response or note to any line in this area. All right, any line in part three. So ideally, you want to use more than these 4 lines. So you're going to check off this box, and then you're going to, you could write see attached, or you can start off here and finish on Schedule O. I would recommend that you just type in see attached, and then on Schedule O, you'll type in part three, and number one, briefly describe the organization's mission, and then you will type in your mission. All right, and then here, when we talk about your organization's program service accomplishments, if you're going to exceed this area here, I would recommend that you do the same thing here. Just write see attached, and then you write it on Schedule O. So here you're going to put in the code for your program, then you're going to type in the expenses, and then you're going to include the number of grants if you give grants, and then you're going to have the revenue. All right. And then you will describe, if you have enough room, you'll describe what your accomplishments have been. If you don't have enough room, I would just say see attached and put this on Schedule O. And you want to do that for your 3 major programs. If you have more than 3 major programs, then you want to include that on Schedule O as well. All right. So again, this is where you tell your story, you tell your accomplishments, you show how you're different from other organizations. If you have benchmarks that you have exceeded, that you track, you might want to include stuff like that as well. Okay, and then here, part four, this is the checklist of required schedules. So here you'll just ask, you'll answer um, questions as to what schedules you might have attached. And 9 times out of 10, if you're listening to me, you probably have a very simple financial structure, and you may not have to attach all of those different schedules, but you definitely want to make sure that you do Schedule O, which is the catch-all for you to begin to explain, get a little bit more information than what's required here on the form. And again, that's how you can differentiate yourself. All right, and then notice under part 5, statements regarding other IRS filings. Check if Schedule O contains a response or note. So if there's anything here that you think might be questionable um, in terms of your response, you want to make sure that you respond and clarify on Schedule O and show that, it's nothing unusual and that you are dealing with it. All right, and then part 6 is the governing body and management. So there's questions here about how your board actually operates, you know. So there are policy questions, and then there are disclosure questions as well. And if there's anything here that looks a little bit unusual, you know, um, then you might want to address that in Schedule O. And then part 7, this is where you talk about your directors and officers salary information and the amount of time they spend. And then you also indicate any independent contractors that make $100,000 or more, from you. So if you're paying any independent contractor more than $100,000, it should go there. If you're paying any um, person on your board or who's an officer more than $100,000, that salary should also be disclosed in that section. All right, part 8. This is the area where you talk about revenue. And if there's anything here that, might cause people to ask questions, that they can't figure out just from looking at your numbers, then you'll check this box, check if Schedule O contains a response there. And then you have your statement of functional expenses. Now, your statement of functional expenses, this is really important because it gives a sense for how much of your money is going towards administration, how much is going toward fundraising, and how much is going towards program and services. So if your numbers look a little bit out of whack, so if your program service expenses are less than 80%, that might be cause for concern. So you need to really be mindful of how you're allocating your expenses. And then part 10, this is your balance sheet. So that'll indicate things like, cash, investments, land and building, and all of that other stuff. That would be your assets. And then liabilities, that would be accounts payable, grants payable, and the like. And then you have your net assets. All right, and then part 11, this is a reconciliation of your net assets. And then part 12 is your financial statements and reporting. So if there's anything here that looks out of whack that bears explaining, then you'll put that on Schedule O. All right, so we're not going to necessarily show you how to fill out the form, but I just wanted to give you some history as to what's on the form so that you can begin to be strategic about how you'll respond. So this is Schedule O, and this is basically, as I said before, it's a catch-all for every question, that needed continuation or anything that looked like it might cause a question. You can answer it here. All right, so if you have any questions, if you can, be sure and post, and I will come to those questions afterwards. All righty, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and then I will share with you an example. Okay, so I'm going to share another tab. All right, so I thought that I would start with the candid people, since GuideStar is the one that encourages everyone else to actually file their Form 990s and to disclose information. I thought that they might provide a pretty interesting example. So we can go to their Form 990, and I did this by going to the Candid website. GuideStar has actually merged with the Foundation Center, and they are now Candid. And I went and I downloaded their Form 990. And I'm not quite sure if you can see this or not. So I'm going to all right. So here is their Form 990. And I thought that this would be a good example. And just know that this is a $30 million operation, so their Form 990 is going to be a little bit more complex than yours, but nevertheless, a 990 is a 990. All right, so they have basically, just shared their information. They've got revenues of $30.7 million. But I just want to share with you how they responded. Notice under Part 3, Statement of Service and Accomplishments, they did not go into detail. They said, see additional data. What they did do is they provided, the expenses, and there were no grants. They didn't make any grants, so that's zero. So they did also include program revenue for their first program. They did the same for their second program, third program, and then there were no other program services. All right. So when they say see additional data, that means that they put it all in Schedule O. So there wasn't a situation where you're starting to read some things and then having to go to yet another page. All right. So what we'll do is we'll go down to their Schedule O and we will see how they in fact responded so that they can put themselves in the most positive light, and then they can also demonstrate, in real detail how much they have been able to accomplish. So as I said before, they have a very, very complex financial situation, so they have a much longer form than most. All right, and notice here under supplemental information, part 5, line 4, they indicated, they shared some explanation as to how their endowment funds are used. So I'm going to just read this one example. The center's endowment funds and board designated amounts for long-term investment consist of permanently restricted net assets, and those are endowment funds, and a board designated amount for long-term investment. The permanently restricted net assets are subject to donor imposed stipulations that the principal be maintained permanently by the center. The center has 3 separate endowments and is permitted to use the income earned on the related investments for general purposes, library acquisitions, and public education. The board designated amount for long-term investment is a fund set aside by the Board of Trustees for long-term investment that ensure the center's financial strength and agility and provide a reserve fund in the event of a financial emergency. So notice the language that they use. So not only are they describing what these funds are being used for, but they're also using words to let you know that they're being wise stewards of this. And they want to make sure that you understand that they're in a position of financial strength. Okay, so I want to go to Schedule O. All right, so this is Schedule O that I was sharing with you, and this is the supplemental information. So this is, again, a catch-all for any information that you don't have room to really describe, and they typically use this a lot for Part 3. So here they indicated that they're responding to line 1 on Form 990, Part 3, and they talk about the mission. So they say the center accomplishes its mission by operating a library and learning centers in 5 locations in New York City, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Cleveland, and San Francisco that offer free access to information, resources, and educational programs, maintaining unique databases of information on more than 140,000 foundations, corporate sponsors and grant-making public charities worldwide, blah, 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 blah. So notice Form 990 only asks for the mission, and they didn't have to explain this, but they went out of their way to provide much more information than was required so that you get a really, really good feeling for how it is they accomplish their mission. All right. And if you want to see this, you can go to GuideStar and just look up their profile, or you can email me at Valerie F. Leonard at Nonprofit Utopia. I can make sure that you get this. And if I remember, I will post this link in our chat. Okay, and then notice too, on line 4A, they describe how they collect data, right? So this part was line 1, and line 4A, if you remember, that was focusing on one of their major programs. So they took the time here to talk about their accomplishments. So they did that for 4A. All of this is for one program, so I'm not going to read all of it. Line B, 4B, this is a separate program, and it goes on and on. And then for line 4B, they just continued here. Line 4C, that is a third program. So I'm going to just share some examples. I promise you I'm not going to read all of that, but this is how they describe some of their accomplishments for their first program. So they say major data collection and publications program accomplishments in 2018 include the following. Foundation Center has forged deep, substantive relationships with global, regional, and country level organizations, such as worldwide initiatives for grant maker support and donors and foundations networks of Europe, to facilitate data gathering and knowledge sharing by their memberships. Our recent work with global partners on issue areas such as human rights, peace and security, and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, has dramatically extended our reach and reputation around the world. Global Data Foundation Center continues to participate in conversations with foreign aid donors, multilateral lenders, and government transparency advocates in pushing to define future data standards as the leader in philanthropic data collection and dissemination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, they go on and on about their accomplishments. So I guess what I'm sharing with you is this. You should really think about what each one of your programs does. You know, think about the goals of your program. Think about the objectives of your programs. Think about the outcomes. You know, what is it that you're trying to change? And what is it that you actually have done for the community? How many people have you served? How have their lives changed as a result of your first program? And then you do the same thing for your second program. How are you different from your competitors? If you're serving a crowded field, how is it that you're still providing services that are relevant? You know, what gaps are you serving? And that particular thing. All right. So that was, basically, my example. And then before I close, I want to encourage you, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share those. But I wanted to share a few a few tips from Robert Lyons, and he is a CPA. And, one of the things he talked about is making sure that you take advantage of all the space that is offered you in Form 990. All too often, I know I have read Form 990s where people were trying to just get through it as quickly as possible, right? And have answers just as short as possible so they can get through it, not realizing that this is not just a document that the IRS is looking at. The IRS, they care about it because they're wanting to make sure that you are, in fact, using the funds as intended and the funds are being used for a charitable purpose. Your donors are looking at this information too because they want to decide whether or not you are a good investment. And if you're just rushing through the form, adding, just answering the question asked, sharing bare minimum information, you are not going to distinguish yourself. And when it comes between looking at your organization and another organization who has taken the time to actually provide information about their organization and how much they've accomplished, then they're definitely going to choose the one that has given them much more information to go on, right? So you want to have as much detail as possible, he says, and you want to be accurate. And again, you want to know your audience. Again, your audience is not just people from the IRS. Your audience is going to be potential funders. Your audience is going to be nosy people like me from the community who want to make sure that people who say they're serving the community are, in fact, serving the community. Your audience is going to be people who want to partner with you. And when people partner with other organizations, they want to make sure that the organizations they're partnering with are up to snuff. And if there are any weaknesses, they want to be able to determine that. And if there are any strengths, they want to be able to determine that. And he also suggests that you sell yourself. As you saw from the example of the Foundation Center Form 990, they sold themselves at every turn. Not only did they describe what they were doing, they were describing how different they were. They were describing their networks and their impact, and you have to do the same thing. And typically, the Form 990 is completed by people who are accountants. And as we know, accountants are trained pretty much like lawyers, which is to answer the question asked, no more, no less, the truth and nothing but the truth. And that doesn't necessarily make for the most interesting story, and it doesn't necessarily capture the full extent of what your organization is about. So you should work with people within your organization who write well, and typically those people are people who run the programs. Those are people who are writing proposals all the time. Those are people who are in your marketing department. So once you flesh out the facts, make sure you run it by somebody who knows how to add the flowery language without detracting from the truth, of course, to make sure that you have an interesting story to tell. All right. And then you also want to make sure that you focus on results. All right. So, again, this is your goal, this is your objective, these are your outcomes, and this is what actually happened. And then you also want to talk about, not only the data, but if you can, talk about some of the human interest stories. You don't want to go on, but you definitely want to be able to create a balance between being succinct, being factual, and telling a story that is interesting and that people want to read. All right. So, if you want to take your disclosure any further, I strongly recommend that you do a guide star profile. I also strongly recommend that you look at the video from last week where we spoke with Roberta Coleman, and she talked about how Cabot House actually used the Form 990 and their Guide Star profile to increase their revenues, and you can do the same. All right, so at this point, I'm going to look at questions and comments. All right, and see what I can share. All right, I don't see any questions about the Form 990. Before I go, if you have any questions about Form 990, please be sure to share them and I can make sure that I answer them. And if there's anything I can't answer, I'll make sure that you get to the right resource. All right. So again, I did post links to our capacity building blocks intensive. We're going to be starting that in February, where we're going to take you through a journey from February 3rd all the way to June 30th, sharing with you things that every nonprofit leader should know about nonprofits. We did share a link to that in the comments. We're hoping that you can, in fact, register. All right. And then if you're having issues with compliance, we do offer coaching. We have a 30-day compliance challenge where we will work with you. We'll look at all of the forms that you need to file on an annual basis with the city, with the state, with the county, with the federal government, just to make sure that you are in fact in compliance. And then let's not forget, you should also be in compliance with any funder that you have. All right, so before I go, I just want to share this comment from Leslie. Leslie is one of our members. She's a devoted member, and she says, very valuable information, Valerie. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your sitting through this. I know it's not the most interesting conversation, but it is definitely one of the most valuable topics that we can share. All righty. Um, and again, before I go, if there are any questions or comments, please feel free to share. All right, there doesn't look like there are any more questions or comments, so I will say goodbye. I will say thank you so much, and I am definitely looking forward to the next year, and you take care. Bye bye.